Okay, tonight we are in Proverbs chapter 23. Proverbs chapter 23. This is what happens. You try to do something different. Proverbs chapter 23. And we're going to be picking up in verse 23. Actually, we'll be picking up in verse 24 is really about where we left off last week, or 2 weeks ago, I guess I should say. And we've been talking about, as you have here on our outline, we looked at verses 9 through 28 is where we're at, looking at various wise sayings and warnings and exhortations. And then we find, as we'll get into here in just a few moments, drunkenness being condemned. And that's a very skeleton outline of that text. So we're picking up in verse 23, Proverbs 23. Here the Bible tells us, buy the truth and do not sell it. Also wisdom and instruction and understanding. We talked about this last time, the idea of doing basically everything you can to obtain truth and making sure we do all we can not to lose it. We also talked about there are those today who, as I said before, almost make profit off of selling religious materials, and that's not found anywhere in the Word of God. He tells us there in verse 23 several things which we are to buy. That is the truth, wisdom, instruction, and understanding. Those are four things that are mentioned there. We talked about that last time. The truth being the truth that makes you free. Wisdom is the judgment and skill that is clearly presented in the Bible. Instruction being the Hebrew word, it involves correction, warning, as well as teaching. And then understanding, that is knowing the meaning of something. Now verse 24 is where we'll actually be picking up this evening. Verse 24 tells us, the father of the righteous will greatly rejoice, and he who begets a wise child will delight in him. Now, we talked about previously up to this point, those who are not listening to their parents. We talked about those who are disobedient, those who bring scorn and all those types of things upon their parents. We talked about that last week as well. If you back up to about verse 19, talks about, again, his son being wise and guiding his heart in the way. And we find other verses to that as well in verse 13 about not withholding correction from a child. Also in verse 12, applying your heart to instruction, those types of things. And here in verse 24, he tells us the father of the righteous, that means the father of a righteous child or children, the Bible says there in verse 24, will greatly rejoice. And does that make perfect sense? If your children are righteous, if they're doing that which is good, that which is pleasing in the sight of God, does that make us happy? And that sounds kind of corny to say that it makes you happy, but it does, doesn't it? Where the righteous make us happy, those who are not behaving like they should do not bring us much joy. He tells us there in verse 24, the father of the righteous will greatly rejoice. We mentioned this last time as well, how when our children do good, we need to make sure they know that. We don't just need to correct them when they do something wrong, but we also need to let them know that we're proud of them when they do something that is good, that is right, so we can encourage them to keep on doing what is good and what is right. Verse 24, he goes on to say, and he who begets a wise child will delight in him. And you think about that. He says, first you're going to find in verse 24, you will rejoice. And then also he says, you will delight. How great is it when our children choose to do what is right? When they choose to follow God. We will delight in them. Verse 25, he says, let your father and your mother be glad, and let her who bore you rejoice. We saw in verse 24 the reaction of the father. Now in verse 25, the reaction of the mother to the one who is doing what is right. He says in verse 25, let your father and your mother be glad, and let her who bore you rejoice. Why? Because they're doing that which is pleasing in the sight of God. You know, I'm preparing for a lesson that I'm doing for a youth event on Friday night, and we're looking at how much time you spend on doing certain things. For example, mine is dealing with sports and video games and those types of things. And sports specifically is something that always worries me, especially today, because we see how people spend so much time in those things. But not just that, but we see how sometimes our parents reward their children more for what they do in sports than what they do in their spiritual life. They pat them on the back when they do well in game, but they don't pat them on the back when they come to services. See, we're encouraging sometimes our children in the wrong things. There's nothing wrong in sports and those types of things in and of themselves, but we need to make sure we encourage our children in what really is important. And we find here in verse 25, it says, "Let your father and your mother be glad, and let her who bore you rejoice." Look at verse 26. "My son, give me your heart, and let your eyes observe my ways." He's asking for his son to let him be an example. Now, that's a pretty bold thing to say, isn't it? But doesn't it remind you of the Apostle Paul? He tells us, "Imitate me as I imitate Christ." The righteous person can, in many ways, say, you know what, let's help one another. Right? Let's say sometimes we kind of use this phrase of accountability partners, which is good and bad in of itself. The idea is being our brother's keeper, though, isn't it? It's looking out for one another, lifting one another up when we fall down, and encouraging one another when we're doing that which is right. And so when he tells us there in verse 26, "My son, give me your heart," he's saying what? Let me instruct you. But now notice, "and let your eyes observe my ways." Now his ways, obviously, by what we've seen already, are those ways which are righteous and which are good and which are pleasing to God. He's not talking about do what I do and observe my wicked ways. He's talking about the right ways. Brother Paul?
So the eyes there are a direct, I don't know if you want to say portal or connection to the heart. In other words, kind of like Jesus said in Matthew 6, whenever he said, "Lay not up for yourself treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." And he said, "For the light of the body is the eye. If therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light. But if thine eye be evil, thy whole body shall be full of darkness." He said here, "Give me your heart." But in the same connection, he said, "Okay, let your eyes observe my ways." So that's how the father is going to instruct the heart of his child in this context. That's one of the main ways that he's going to instruct the heart of his child, is by showing him what the ways are. To your point that you made a moment ago, this country has been filled with people, and the church is no exception to this. In fact, the church is maybe as guilty or maybe more guilty than others in this fact of going to great lengths to get kids involved in all these other things, but never making Bible study or spiritual matters a priority. But, drive halfway across the country to go to a game that the kid's going to play in. And that's not that would sound like an exaggeration to some, but that's not an exaggeration. There are people who will drive, across several states to take their kids to compete in special tournaments and things like that. Well, I'm not saying that that's in and of itself a bad thing. What I am saying is if that's what your time is filled with, if that's what your kids' eyes are observing, that's what their heart's getting filled with. And if they also see that be displaced, see that displacing spiritual things, kicking those out of your life, or there's no time for that, no room for that because of those things, then your child's going to grow up thinking. So we're living in a country where, to your invitation, we're living in a country that, we think we can just completely displace God out of our lives. And so, God's going to laugh at it in the sense of scoffing, like almost an unbelieving laugh. Like, you can't be serious that you think this way. And then, but this is the problem right here. Whether a parent wants to or not, they are filling their child's heart every day. Final fact, the child's eyes are observing their hearts.
I had a man tell me one time, when I was at another location, he'd tell me, "Well, we make a lot of sacrifices. And what he meant was he sacrificed missing services to take his kids to certain events, to sporting events. And I listened to him for a second and I said, don't you think you have that backwards? Because his idea of sacrifice was, I'll make a sacrifice when I miss services and I take my kids to these things. And what he didn't realize is how backwards that is. That's not a sacrifice, that's a mistake. Our sacrifice is we're going to give up these things because God is more important. He's doing exactly the opposite. He says there in verse 25, verse 26, my son, give me your heart and let your eyes observe my ways. Like Paul was talking about a minute ago, we used to hear sometimes people say that the eyes are the windows to the soul, that type of thing. You look in a person's eyes sometimes, when you talk with the person, when you look them in the eye, especially when you're having a very serious conversation, it changes everything. To talk to them on the phone, through messaging or whatever, that's one thing. But when you're face-to-face, looking eye to eye with someone, sometimes it's amazing what changes. And when you find here in verse 26, he says, my son, give me your heart and let your eyes observe my ways. He's asking for his son to say, look, this is my example I'm laying forth. Follow this example. Now that is, like I said before, that's a bold thing to say. But his ways, as we have seen already, are the ways of righteousness, those ways which are pleasing in the sight of God. Now let's look here in verse 27. Verse 27 and verse 28 says, for a harlot is a deep pit, and a seductress is a narrow well. She also lies in wait as for a victim, and increases the unfaithful among men. Now a harlot is, and there's a lot of ways you can describe this. Of course, you can apply it to like a prostitute and those types of things. All we're talking about here in many ways is the idea of a wicked person enticing other people to be wicked with them. We can talk about the harlot, we can talk about this, that, and the other, but the idea is this person enticing someone else to do sinful things with them. Look at verse 28. She also lies in wait as for a victim and increases the unfaithful among men, which means she causes more people to be unfaithful. Now notice there in verse 27, he also says, and a seductress is a narrow well. Now, a narrow well is the idea that it's like falling into a pit, or a narrow pit, as the King James says there. It's like falling into a place you don't want to be. I've never heard anyone falling into a well and saying, yes, I fell into a well. You don't hear that. What do? They call out to be rescued. Well, he says here, this is what this person is like. You fall into a narrow well, that's a small well where you can't hardly move and get out, right? The worst kind. Verse 28, she also lies in wait as for a victim and increases the unfaithful among men. Why? Because she lies in wait to see who she can just pull to do sinful things with her. Now we know, of course, we don't mean just females or other ones who do this. We know men do the same thing as well. Sometimes the worst enemy of a man is another man trying to get them to do sinful things. And so we find here in verse 27, 28, we must be on guard against those who are trying to lure us away to do sinful things, because we find in verse 28, it only increases the unfaithful men on the earth. It increases unfaithfulness. We cannot be pulled away. And the idea of a harlot being used there, or a seductress, also in verse 27, means it's very enticing. I've never been enticed or been tempted to do something that I really didn't want to do. People can try to tempt you with certain things. There are certain things you're like, nah, I'm not interested in that. And it's easy because it's not a temptation to you. Whereas something else that it really is tempting, and they come and they invite you or try to get you to do whatever it is, it's totally different. Well, a seductress or a harlot here in verse 27 is painting the picture of something that you really want to do. They're going to lure you away and increase, as we find in verse 28, the unfaithful among men. Now, verse 29, obviously, and following, we have here being discussed those who are engaging in alcoholic drink, right? Now, think about this for a moment. How many times have you heard people say, well, it's okay to drink just so long as you don't become drunk? And we've talked about this once before already, but never in the Bible has a little bit of wrong been okay so long as you don't get carried away. Because really that's what it's talking about, right? A little bit of wrong is not okay, whereas a lot of it is automatically wrong. We looked at verse 29. Who has woe? Who has sorrow? Now, this to me is interesting because you look on television, I've never seen the advertisements of a person who's drinking. Picture a person as a person who has woes, sorrows, contentions, complaints, wounds without cause, rinse of eyes. That is never shown on the commercials, right? That's never shown. I wonder why that is. Because that's not going to sell. But look again at verse 29. Who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who has contentions? Who has complaints? Who has wounds without cause? Who has redness of eyes? Now these are characteristics of those, as we find in verse 30, who, quote, linger long at the wine. Does that mean if you don't linger long at the wine, it's okay? No. We find in the New Testament, the idea is found very clearly by the Apostle Paul that we are not to even begin the process of becoming drunk. Do not be what? Do not be drunk with dispensation, right? Or do not be drunk, which is dispensation. The idea that don't even begin becoming drunk. He says in verse 29, who has all these things? In verse 30, those who linger long at the wine. Those who go in search of mixed wine. That shows us those whose life seems to be is only centered around becoming drunk and intoxicated. That's all it is. Those who linger long at the wine. Those who go in search of mixed wine. Look at verse 31. Do not look on the wine. Is that now? Think about this. There are those who say drinking a little bit is okay, but notice what he says here in verse 31. And tell me if it still is okay if we drink. Do not look on the wine when it is red, when it sparkles in a cup, when it swirls around smoothly. At the last, it bites like a serpent and stings like a viper. Now, we find in verse 31, do not look on the wine. He says what? When it does all these things, when it's red, when it sparkles, when it looks appealing, right? Now, if we're not to look upon it when it does all these things and tempts us, should we be partaking of it in a social, anything besides medicinal, basically? Should we be having those things if we're not even to look upon it? He says when it sparkles in a cup, when it swirls around smoothly. Verse 32, at the last it bites like a serpent and stings like a viper. Means it starts out looking nice, but its end is an ugly one. It's not a very pretty one. He says it bites like a serpent. The idea of there being a snake, right? And stings like a viper. Some translations talk about the viper being perhaps a scorpion, but the picture, whatever we may describe it as, is not a pleasant one. If there's any chance that something I'm going to partake in is going to bite like a serpent and sting like a viper, I don't want anything to do with it. I don't want anything to do with it. And we find here in verse 31, looking here in Proverbs, now remember, Solomon, a man who basically tells us that he did everything he could possibly do on earth to find pleasure. And we'll see that later in Ecclesiastes, perhaps, Lord willing. But here we find in Proverbs, in the midst of the father teaching his son to follow his ways, he warns him about alcohol. Isn't it interesting that this father speaks to his son to warn him, while today we have this classified by many under the umbrella of sowing your wild oats. Boys will be boys. That's not right. That's not biblical. That's condoning sin for a certain period of time, for a certain age group. That's not right at all. In fact, we find also the idea that we are to remember our Creator in the days of our youth. That doesn't sound like sowing wild oats, does it? So we find here in verse 32, at the last it bites like a serpent and stings like a viper. And notice verse 33 and following. Your eyes will see strange things, and your heart will utter perverse things. And you think about that for a moment. Does that sound like something you want to be involved in? Your eyes will see strange things. Now, when I turn on television, I see enough strange things already. When I see the people around us in the world today, I see enough strange things. And we find in verse 33, and your heart will utter perverse things, which means you'll not only see things that are strange, perhaps the idea of even seeing things that aren't really there, perceiving things differently. He says, your heart will utter perverse things. Your sight and your speech are going to be affected by it. Verse 34, yes, you will be like one who lies down in the midst of the sea, or like one who lies at the top of the mast. Now think about this. If you lie down in the midst of the sea, that's not a very smart place to be, is it? Or lying down at the top of the mast, the idea of being at the top of a ship and that mast, right? That's not a safe place to be. Lying, that's not where you usually lie down at. Saying, they have struck me, but I was not hurt. They had beaten me, but I did not feel it. When shall I awake that I may seek another drink? Now you think about that for a moment. That picture that is painted there in just those few verses. And we still have those who argue to their blue in their face that drinking a little bit is not a big deal. It's interesting that we have this entire section here, just these 6 verses alone, at least in this one location, in the midst of a father instructing his son, and he includes there the idea of staying away from alcohol. You can't go back to verse 31 and talk about how you're not to look upon it, and then turn around and say, well, a little bit's okay. I thought we weren't supposed to even look upon it. Because what's going to happen? He says it's going to bite like a serpent and sting like a viper. You're going to see strange things. Your heart will utter perverse things. You're not going to be yourself, right? It changes you. Yes, you'll be like one who lies down in the midst of the sea, or like one who lies at the top of the mast, saying, they have struck me, but I was not hurt. They have beaten me, but I did not feel it. When shall I awake that I may seek another drink? That last phrase really summarizes those who have no problem with these types of things. Those who wake up in the morning saying, do you remember what we did last night, and joke about it? That's the same idea we find here at the end of this verse. When shall I awake that I may seek another drink? When can I wake up so I can start all over again, putting myself in danger and others in danger? Because that's what happens. Brother Paul?
Proverbs 31, Solomon is relaying what his mother taught him as he was younger. It says the words of King Lemuel, which is basically a symbolic name of Solomon, meaning belonging to God. The words of King Lemuel, the prophecy that his mother taught him, what my son, and what the son of my womb, and what the son of my battle. Now she warns him against these two very things that chapter 23 we talked about. Basically alcohol and the wrong kind of woman.
every time it's interesting that there are certain things that seem to never go away. Certain arguments about certain topics never seem to go away. Alcohol being one, marriage and divorce, of course, being another, those types of things. But it's interesting that when we go back and we look and we read carefully, we find the truth is really right there in front of us. We go to, how many times you hear people talk about how Christ in John chapter 2 turned water into wine, and they say, well, Christ drunk wine, and you think, okay, because we understand people applying today's definition of wine to Old Testament definition or New Testament definition of wine and those types of things. But yet we find here in Proverbs 23, where it's very clear the dangers of alcohol being presented. It's very clear how many times that Christ and the apostles and others condemned drunkenness, how the Bible condemns and warns about alcohol over and over and over again. And we're supposed to believe in John chapter 2, when Christ took all those water pots of 20 to 30 gallons apiece and he made alcoholic wine. You think, how could that be possible? Because he would be contributing to drunkenness, which him and those who are followers of him have condemned. And so obviously that's not what has happened there. Now, to get back to what we're talking about here in Proverbs 23, we have these warnings, we have these wise sayings, we have these pleas to find the truth, to do all you can to obtain it, and to do all you can to keep yourself from losing it. Now we get into chapter 24 of Proverbs, chapter 24, and it begins quite simply in verse 1. It says, do not be envious of evil men, nor desire to be with them. The world can be very tempting when we see what the wicked possess sometimes. We see their perceived success. We see their perceived blessings. I heard a lady tell me one time, well, I'm friends with this person over here. I work with her, and they talk about how blessed they are in their denomination. I said, their blessings are based upon physical things. You can't be in a place that is teaching false doctrine and have false hope and then turn around and say you are blessed, because you're not. They may have physical things, but we should not confuse physical with spiritual blessings, because we know one's going to fade away and one's going to endure. And so we look here in Proverbs 24, we have that same idea. We shouldn't be envious of those around us who are doing evil things and are, not say, reaping the benefits of living in a sinful world and prospering from living a sinful life. Because as we read about throughout the New Testament, time and time again, those who are not wealthy, but those who are loving riches are being condemned. The Bible warns us. The Apostle Paul warned Timothy, beware of the love of money. It wasn't money; it was the love of money. And we look here in Proverbs 24. Do not be envious of evil men. Do not be envious of evil men, nor desire to be with them. It's not just wealth sometimes either. Sometimes it's their friendships. It's their associations. It's their quote-unquote connections. But we have to remember why we're not to be envious or jealous of them. Look again at verse 1. Do not be envious of who? Not just of any type of man, but of evil men. When I look around and see the brotherhood and I see the great, tremendous fellowship, I'm not envious. I'm thankful. But we find here that what's being discouraged is not being envious of godly men, because we want to be like other godly men and see and build ourselves up after other godly examples as well. But here, the idea of not being envious of, jealous of evil men, those who are doing things which are not pleasing in the sight of God. It doesn't matter how successful a person appears. If they are not a faithful Christian, it's like Christ tells us, what will a man give in exchange for his soul? Well, name it. They'll give about anything. Well, you find in verse 24, do not be envious of evil men, nor desire to be with them. Because evil men, we back up in Proverbs 23 and so many other times in Proverbs, the warning about going into the wrong kind of people. We just read about the harlot, didn't we? She would fall underneath the category of evil people, wouldn't she? So we shouldn't be jealous of them or desire to have the same type of perceived blessings that people have today, because when the day closes and Christ returns, all their blessings are going to disappear. And all that will be found sitting before God is an evil person. So why do we want to be like them? We want to be like those who are putting God first and doing all they can to get to heaven and to bring others with them as well. Now look at verse 2. He tells us yet again more reasons why we should not be envious of evil men. He says, for their heart devises violence. The King James says, for their heart studieth destruction. The idea is they are trying to do what? They are planning how to do wicked things. Their heart devises violence, and their lips talk of troublemaking. You know, you think back to when you were a child. Did you have those who sit around and they seem to always get in some kind of trouble? Maybe at the time didn't seem like such a big deal, or maybe it wasn't anything major. Maybe it's just something we say simple as not listening to their parents as they should, or not coming home when they were told to come home. You know, I can remember being around kids in my neighborhood and saying, as we're leaving or trying to get to our homes, we're saying, well, what are you going to tell our parents about why we're late? Doesn't sound like much, but isn't that devising troublemaking? What can I say to lie to my parents to get what I've done that's wrong to be, quote unquote, smoothed over, not being a big deal? It can be something as small as that, or it can be something mentally as we grow older. Sometimes it's not just the devising violence or planning out things that are physical. Sometimes it's in our mind, and it's us saying, how can I convince myself that this sinful action is okay? See, it grows as we get older, doesn't it? It goes from disobeying parents or telling little white lies, which a lie is a lie, isn't it? To convincing ourselves that sin is okay. Because we hear that phrase so many times, you know, get them when they're young or start them out when they're young. Because as we get older, the problems just continue. They only get worse. We try to brush away sin in our own lives. Brush away the sin of other people's lives. And then before you know it, we have a nation like ours, don't we? We have the brotherhood who is strong, and no doubt, in many areas, but it's crumbling in others. That's why we are where we are, not because of other people, because of ourselves. We convince ourselves that certain things are okay when they're not. He tells us there in verse 2, for their heart devises violence, and their lips talk of troublemaking. Through wisdom, notice here in verse 3, through wisdom a house is built, and by understanding it is established. He shows here how, again, similar to building on the rock that Christ talks about in the New Testament, right? The wise man built his house upon the rock. The storms came, the winds blew, and what happened? It stood. But the foolish man built his house upon the sand. The rains came, the winds blew. What happened? It fell. And great was its fall, right? We find a similar idea here in verse 3. Through wisdom, a house is built, and by understanding, it is established. It is firm. It's not going anywhere. That's why it's important that as we bring up our children, that we lay that solid foundation and we build them up. So as they get older and they face life and the storms come, the winds blow, the rains come, that it doesn't move. Doesn't mean they won't decide at some point to change the foundation themselves or move somewhere else in a spiritual sense. But there'll be no denying what they have been taught, what is the correct foundation. He tells us there in verse 3, through wisdom a house is built, and by understanding it is established. Look at verse 4. By knowledge the rooms are filled with all precious and pleasant things. By knowledge they are filled with what? Precious and all pleasant riches, there in verse 4. When we put God first, our homes will be established and our homes will be filled with the right things. I don't really think he's talking about physical, precious stones and riches. He's talking about a home that is what? Filled with godly wisdom, godly hearts, and putting God first. We go all the way back to the book of Deuteronomy. And Moses tells them there in Deuteronomy chapter 6 about teaching your children when what? when you're walking in the way, when you lie down, when you rise up, all those types of things. He says, let the law of God be as frontlets between your eyes and on the lamppost of your house. Let it be on you, on your children, and in your house. And that seems to be the same idea here. It builds a house and it fills the house with right, godly things. See, when we go back and we talk to those sometimes who are, especially those who are in school systems and those who are out in the public secular world working, and you hear and you see sometimes firsthand how the home in so many places is crumbling. And what we fail to realize is that affects so much. It affects not only that home, but it affects the community. It affects, and it keeps going up, community, the state, the country, everybody. But most importantly, it affects the souls of each and every person in that home. And so when we look here in verses 3 and 4, the idea of this house being built on the right things, and therefore being filled with the right things, why? Why? What is it built upon? How is it being filled? It's built upon wisdom and understanding, and it's filled with what? Knowledge. Knowledge is what fills the house. And what kind of knowledge are we talking about? Knowledge of God. Knowledge of what God wants us to do. Now let's look at verse 5. See, our clock isn't up there, so I keep having to look at my watch. Verse 5, a wise man is strong, yes, a man of knowledge increases strength. Now here we have pictured a man who is we have the description like a strong person, and we show why they're strong. And it's the physical relating to spiritual, isn't it? A strong man is strong why? Here, he's strong because he is wise. Yes, a man of knowledge increases strength. How do you keep increasing strength? By keep increasing knowledge. By keep studying and growing. And we get what? Stronger in a spiritual sense because we keep adding the Word of God to our lives. We keep growing that spiritual muscle, so to speak, there, as we found there in verse 5. A wise man is strong. Now think about this. If one is true, the opposite also is true, isn't it? The foolish man is weak, right? The foolish man is weak. Yes, a man of what? No knowledge loses strength, doesn't he? Their strength disappears. See, sometimes when we flip it around, we see what it means a little more clearly. When we don't have knowledge, and we're not trying to gain more knowledge, we're just losing it. You know, I think about some of these bodybuilders and things that as they get older and they get out of the sport, they turn from these big hulking guys to guys who look, I guess, more normal size because they're not hitting the gym like they used to. You know, you look at old pictures of guys like Arnold and those types of things, back in their quote-unquote heyday, they were monster guys. And as they've gotten older because of health and other reasons, they can't quite do that. They have changed. They've gotten significantly weaker. Not saying he's weak, but much weaker, right? Well, here in a spiritual sense, the person who is not exercising themselves to be wise, exercising themselves to increase in knowledge, they're not gaining strength. They're only going to lose it. You take anyone who's been in a gym any time at all, you tell them, you know what, you're not going to the gym for the next 2 months. Okay? What's going to happen? Everything that they used to do in the gym is going to have to be decreased by a certain percentage because they will lose muscle at a pretty rapid pace. And they'll have to what? Work and build it back up. In the spiritual sense, if we take time off, we're going to lose the spiritual muscle. And what's a bigger problem is sometimes we don't ever get back to it. We just get weaker and weaker and weaker. And that's something we do not want to do. We're going to stop there this evening. And next week, Lord willing, we'll pick up in Proverbs 24 and verse 6. And so we'll consider ourselves dismissed this evening. I do thank you for your time and for your attention. And we'll be done at this time.